The Count forced the slaves to dance as women, until one of them planned brutal revenge. The floorboards were cold under Cassius's bare feet, even though the ballroom above him burned with candlelight and laughter. He could feel that laughter through the ceiling the way a man feels thunder through a roof. Heavy, careless, far too close. They had left him down here for an hour in the dark to soften his pride. That was the Count's phrase. Soft as iron in a forge, Cassius thought, until it bends to whatever hand holds the hammer. The cellar smelled of damp brick, sour wine, and old smoke. A single lantern hung from a hook, its flame wavering like it was afraid to look at him. In that thin light he saw himself in fragments, the broad shoulders that had carried anvils, the crushed knuckles that had shaped horseshoes and plowed teeth, the wrists thick as wagon axles. Then he saw what they had done to those wrists. Lace, red silk, a corset cinched so tightly he could barely draw breath without pain. The fabric bit into his ribs with every inhale, like a belt around a barrel that was already ready to split. The skirt pooled around his ankles, too fine, too bright, too wrong against the scars on his legs. Somewhere above, a violin slid into a waltz, sweet as honey and just as sticky. The music drifted down the stairwell, inviting him to walk into his own humiliation. The door at the top of the steps opened. Light spilled down in a long blade. Cassius blinked once, then steadied his face. "Time," Malcolm Pritchard said. Pritchard's boots thudded down the stairs. He didn't hurry. He never needed to. He carried his power the way a man carries a pistol. Quiet, sure, already cocked. The overseer's eyes swept Cassius from head to toe and curled with amusement. "Look at you," he said softly, like a man admiring a well-trained dog. "Count's gonna be pleased. Governor, too. You best keep that pretty mouth shut unless you're singing." Cassius tasted copper. For a heartbeat he thought it was blood, but it was only the shock of forcing himself not to answer. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Pritchard leaned closer, the sourness of whiskey on his breath. "One wrong step tonight, and your wife goes on the block by sunrise. You hear me?" Cassius heard him. He heard every word as if it were being branded into his skull. He heard the baby in Sarah's belly kick 2 rooms away down in the quarters, heard Ruth's small sleep murmurs, heard the way Sarah had tried to be brave while her hands trembled on his shirt earlier that evening. He nodded once. "Good boy," Pritchard's smile said. "Up," the overseer ordered, and lifted his whip just enough for Cassius to see it, not raised to strike, only to remind. Cassius climbed the stairs. At the top, the music swelled. Heat hit him like an open oven door. The ballroom roared with perfume, cigar smoke, spilled brandy, and the thick floral sweetness of magnolias bleeding in from the veranda. Crystal chandeliers threw light everywhere, on white gloves, on diamonds, on shining boots, on mouths stretched wide in laughter. The guests weren't looking at him yet. Not fully. They were still settling in their seats, still clapping for the Count as he strutted to the center of the room with a goblet raised high, his accent soft and theatrical. "Ah, my friends," Count Henri Beaumont announced. "Tonight we are blessed with entertainment more refined than any Parisian stage." Cassius felt Fletcher and Marcus step into formation behind him. He didn't turn his head, but the presence of those men was a rope around his spine, keeping it straight. They were dressed like him, painted like him, bound in the same velvet shame. Across the room, Cassius saw Sarah standing boxed between 2 maids. Her belly was round beneath a plain work dress. Her eyes were on him, and only him. She didn't cry, not in front of them. She just held their daughter's hand so tight, little Ruth's knuckles went pale. Cassius took his place on the polished dance floor. The violin began the first slow turn. 1, 2, 3. His boots slid over the wood. The skirt dragged, whispering around his ankles. Laughter sparked in the crowd, sharp as flint. 1, 2, 3. He kept his chin up. He stared past them all, beyond the chandeliers, beyond the white columns of the manor, to a place inside himself where no man could put a leash. The corset cut deeper. His breath grew smaller. The music grew prettier, crueler. Then, as the Count stepped down to watch him closer, Cassius caught a faint smell that didn't belong among all that luxury. Smoke, not cigar smoke, not candle smoke. Something raw, something hungry. His pulse kicked once, hard. He knew that smell. It was the smell of the forge when Benjamin fed the bellows too fast. It was the smell of cotton catching fire in a dry shed. It was the smell of a clock starting to tick. Cassius turned on the waltz again, and his mind slid backward through the smoke, through the silk, through the laughter, back to the first night the Count ever handed him a dress and called it entertainment. But to understand why blood stained the soil tonight, we must go back to where it all began. Long before he ever touched silk, Cassius touched iron. Before the chandelier light burned his eyes, the southern sun had been the only flame he worked beneath. It beat down on the Beaumont plantation in relentless waves, turning the cotton fields into a white sea that shimmered and swallowed men whole. From sunup to sundown, the place breathed dust, sweat, and the slow drag of exhaustion. Every plank of wood, every stalk of cotton, every horseshoe nailed to every hoof carried the fingerprints of those whose names were never spoken aloud. Cassius Washington had been born on that land. Not onto it, on it. Under an oak tree near the workers' quarters, his mother had labored through a storm, gripping the roots while lightning split the sky. For 32 years, he had never stepped beyond the property lines except to deliver wagon wheels or iron tools to neighboring estates. Freedom was a word he spoke only in prayer, never in conversation. In the mornings, he was the first to rise. His forge sat at the far edge of the estate, separated from the main quarters by a narrow path lined with wild rye. When the mist rolled low across the fields, he could almost imagine he was alone in a world untouched by chains. He'd open the forge doors, breathe in the scent of ash and oil, and strike steel until the bell clanged through the valley. The work was hard, but it was his, the only thing in his life that belonged to him. Sarah would visit him sometimes. She'd walk down the path with a tin cup of coffee cradled in both hands, steam rising like prayer smoke. She was small, with a soft, quiet strength that slipped beneath the notice of the overseers. Her smile was something Cassius held on to like a talisman. She could calm him with a touch to the shoulder, a whispered reminder that their daughter Ruth was waiting at home, that the world still held pieces worth living for. Ruth was 5 years old and had her mother's eyes, bright, curious, a contradiction to the bleakness around her. When Cassius sat her on his knee, she'd trace the ridges of his palms with her tiny fingers, as if reading the story carved into them. "Papa," she'd ask, "why you hands look like tree bark?" He'd laugh softly. "Because they've been growing through fire, little one." Life was hard. Life was unfair. But in those moments, over coffee, over shared bread, over a lullaby hummed low at night, there was something that looked almost like peace. Then came the Count. Henri Beaumont arrived from New Orleans with a coat lined in silver thread and a carriage so polished it reflected the sky. He was a man who smiled with only one side of his mouth and watched everything with the cold curiosity of someone inspecting livestock. His French accent intrigued the local gentry, and his wealth dazzled them. Within weeks he had become the center of every social gathering, every hunt, every whispered conversation. But where the neighbors saw charm, the slaves saw rot. It started slowly. Cassius noticed the shift first in the way Beaumont spoke to the women, compliments delivered like commands, touches disguised as gestures of kindness. Then came the confiscation of mirrors, jewelry, small personal belongings. He said he needed them for inventory. Sarah saw what he really wanted. control. Overseers changed too. Malcolm Pritchard had always been cruel, but under the Count's influence he grew inventive. Punishments became performances. Tasks became tests. The master's house began holding gatherings twice a month, each more grandiose than the last. New musicians arrived, imported wines by the crate. Carriages lined the long road like a parade, yet something darker lurked beneath the glamour. One evening, Cassius was summoned to the great house to repair a broken railing. He worked quietly on the veranda, hammering nails while laughter spilled through the windows in waves. But then the laughter changed. It sharpened at the edges, turned mean. Cassius paused, listening. A violin soared into a bright, mocking melody. Then he heard the Count's voice. "Encore! Oh, they are magnificent, non?" The crowd roared. Cassius set his hammer down. Something in that laughter chilled him deeper than any winter wind. When he stepped away from the railing and peered through the side window, his breath caught. On the brightly lit stage, 6 slaves stood in floor-length dresses, powdered faces gleaming under the candles. Their movements were jerky, mechanical, forced. The guests applauded, hooted, clapped each time one slipped on the hem or misstepped. One man stumbled and fell. Laughter doubled. Beaumont rose from his seat, gesturing dramatically. "You see, with a little refinement, even beasts can become ladies." The humiliation struck Cassius like a hammer blow. That night, when he returned to the quarters, Sarah saw the storm in his eyes. "You all right?" she whispered. Cassius didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight with rage he didn't dare release, not with Ruth asleep against Sarah's chest, not with Pritchard circling outside like a hungry wolf. Yet the shadow had fallen, and shadows only grow longer. As the days passed, Beaumont's twisted hobby expanded. New fabrics arrived, cosmetics, false hair pieces. He summoned men at random, forcing them to audition. Those who resisted were whipped. Those who complied were broken. Cassius managed to evade selection until one evening when Pritchard appeared at his door. "Master wants you," he said simply. Sarah's fingers tightened around Cassius's wrist. "No," she whispered. "Please, Cass." "No." He kissed her forehead, held her hand until she reluctantly let go. Then he followed Pritchard into the night, unaware that this path would end not in humiliation, but in fire. The night Cassius was taken into the great house, the moon was full. A pale, watchful eye hung over the Mississippi fields. The path from the quarters to the veranda seemed longer than usual, lined with shadows that whispered threats. Every step Cassius took felt heavier, as if the earth were warning him to turn back. But he couldn't. Pritchard walked ahead, his boots crunching the gravel with unhurried confidence. Cassius followed in silence, jaw tight, fists clenched. He could feel the eyes of the other slaves watching from their cabin doorways, their fear traveling through the humid air like smoke. Inside the house, lamps blazed, music swirled. The scent of wine, roasted duck, and perfume pressed down on Cassius the moment he crossed the threshold. It was a different world. Elegant, cruel, indifferent. One designed to remind slaves that they were nothing but props in someone else's theater. "Wait here," Pritchard ordered, then vanished behind a tall door. The hallway was silent, except for the muffled hum of voices upstairs. Cassius stared at the gold-framed portraits lining the wall. Generations of Beaumonts, stiff and pale, gazed down at him with the arrogance of men who had never worked a day in their lives. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him. Then the door opened. Count Henri Beaumont stepped out, wearing a velvet coat the color of midnight. His hair was immaculately styled, his boots polished to mirror brightness, but his eyes, those cold, ocean-blue eyes, were empty in a way that made Cassius's spine tighten. "Ah, Monsieur Washington," Beaumont said smoothly, "our prized blacksmith, Tonight you begin your cultural transformation. Cassius's throat tightened. Sir, I'm needed at the forge at dawn. Not anymore, Beaumont interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. Tonight you dance. Demain you dance again, and you will continue dancing until I tire of it. Beaumont walked in a slow circle around him, studying him as one might study a horse before auction. You have strength, he murmured. Presence. A certain dignity. He smiled thinly. How delightful it will be to break it. Cassius's heart thudded. He tasted iron in his mouth. Beaumont clapped twice. The door to a side room opened. 3 men entered, each holding objects Cassius never expected to see in their hands. A corset, a wig of coiled curls, a gown of silk so smooth and pale it gleamed like moonlight. No, Cassius said quietly. Beaumont paused. Excuse me. Cassius met his gaze. I will not wear that. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the music from upstairs seemed to fade. Beaumont tilted his head slightly. Pritchard! The overseer stepped forward. Cassius barely had time to react. 2 men grabbed his arms from behind, wrenching them back. Pritchard struck him across the face with the back of his hand. The blow sent Cassius reeling, but he didn't fall. He refused to fall. Beaumont's lips curled in a smile. Small, vicious. You misunderstand your role here, Beaumont said softly. You are not a guest. You are not an artisan. You are entertainment. Pritchard grabbed Cassius by the jaw, forcing him to look up. Master said dance, he hissed, so you best learn to dance. The men forced Cassius into a chair. The corset was pulled tight around him, crushing his ribs until his breath came out in shallow, painful bursts. His shirt was ripped away, the wig jammed over his close-cropped hair. Powder coated his skin, whitening him until he barely recognized his own reflection in the tall mirror they turned him toward. It was worse than punishment. It was erasure. Cassius stared into the mirror, at the falseness they draped over him, at the mockery they shaped him into. His reflection looked like a stranger, a broken man pretending to be something he wasn't. But beneath the powder, beneath the silk, his eyes still burned. Beaumont saw it. That look, the Count murmured. That defiance. I've seen it before. It will fade. Cassius didn't respond. You will join the others tonight, Beaumont instructed. And if you embarrass me, even slightly, your wife and child will be sold by sunrise. Cassius's breath stopped. Sarah. Ruth. He felt the world tilt sideways. The corset squeezed tighter, the air thinner. For an instant he imagined the auction block, Sarah's frightened eyes as they tore Ruth from her arms. He nodded once, stiffly. Beaumont smiled, satisfied. You see? Even the strongest iron bends when the fire's hot enough. Pritchard shoved Cassius toward the staircase leading to the ballroom. The music grew louder with each step. Trilling violins, laughter spilling through the cracks beneath the doors, the clink of crystal glasses raised in celebration. But Cassius heard none of it. All he heard were the cries of men forced to dance before him. All he saw were the bruises on their wrists. All he felt was the weight of the corset, pulling tighter and tighter, as if Beaumont's hand were around his lungs. The ballroom doors opened. Light swallowed him. The guests cheered. He stepped into the glow, each movement a betrayal of his own spirit. He felt the humiliation settle on his skin like a second layer of powder. But deep inside, beneath the silk, beneath the pain, beneath the shame, something ancient twisted awake. Not fire. Iron. Iron remembers the shape it once held. It remembers the forge. It remembers the hand that hammered it into form, and it remembers that it can be reforged. Tonight, Cassius bent. But he did not break. He could feel the truth forming inside him, heavy and sharp. This was the night the revenge began. Night settled thick and suffocating over the Beaumont plantation, but Cassius could not sleep. Even hours after the humiliating performance, the powder still clung to his skin, the corset bruised his ribs, and the Count's laughter echoed inside his skull like a mocking drum. He sat on the edge of the cot in the forge, elbows on his knees, palms pressed together. The forge was dark except for the faint red glow of cooling embers. He could feel the heat, steady, patient, waiting. Iron never truly slept. It simply waited for a hand brave enough to shape it. A soft rustle broke the silence. Cassius. Sarah stood in the doorway, her thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her belly heavy with their unborn child. Moonlight shaped her face in silver and shadow, but even in darkness he saw the worry etched deep into her eyes. "I thought they weren't letting you come," Cassius murmured. "They weren't," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. But Fletcher distracted Pritchard, said the cows got loose again in the south pasture. Gave me a moment to slip away. Cassius exhaled shakily. "You shouldn't risk it." She stepped into the room. "You're my husband. I'll risk more than this." Sarah sank beside him, her hands moving up to touch the powder still smeared along his jawline. Her fingers trembled slightly. "What they made you do?" Her voice broke. "Cassius, I saw your face up there. I saw how they paraded you around like you weren't even a man." He looked away. "I did what I had to. For you, for Ruth, for the baby." Sarah swallowed hard. "I know, but something changed in you tonight. I can feel it." She wasn't wrong. Cassius had felt the shift the moment he stepped into the ballroom. It wasn't shame, not anymore. It was something colder, sharper, as if a piece of iron inside him had snapped loose and begun to forge itself into something dangerous. "They ain't done with me," Cassius said quietly. "Beaumont, he wants to use me more, wants to twist me into whatever thing he finds amusing." Sarah closed her eyes, her breath hitching. "Then we gotta run." Cassius shook his head. "Pritchard keeps the quarters watched all night. Dogs, lantern patrols. Even if we got past the gates, they'd hunt us for days." He paused. "And there's the others." Sarah blinked. "The others?" Cassius nodded. "Marcus, Fletcher, Benjamin, and the families behind us. Beaumont isn't just breaking me, Sarah. He's breaking all of us. If I run, he'll take his rage out on the rest." Sarah lowered her head. "Then what are you thinking?" Cassius looked at the forge. "I'm thinking we stop being the hunted." A faint creak behind them made them both turn. Marcus, the elder of the enslaved workers, gray-haired, slow-moving but sharp-eyed as a hawk, stepped inside. "I've been listening for a few minutes," he said. "You speaking sense. More sense than any man here dared speak aloud." Cassius opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus raised a hand. "You ain't quiet when you're angry, boy," he said softly. "I heard that iron screaming when you came in tonight. Heard you pound the table. Heard something ready to burst." Cassius grimaced. "Marcus, I can't drag you into—" "You ain't dragging nobody," Marcus interrupted. "We already in it. Beaumont's sick games. They ain't stopping. Tonight was the worst we seen. Tomorrow gon' be worse than that. You ain't the only one who got a line he won't let a man cross." Cassius exchanged a look with Sarah, whose hands tightened around his. Then another figure appeared in the doorway. Fletcher, big as an ox, his face shadowed, his jaw clenched. "You think you the only one who felt sick tonight," he rasped. "I've been lifting logs all my life, but tonight I felt smaller than a child." They laughed at us, at our wives watching us, at our children learning that their fathers got no dignity left. Benjamin followed him in, a young man, barely 21, full of anger that had never found direction until now. His hands still bore the marks of rope burns from being disciplined earlier that month for refusing to dance. "I'll do anything," Benjamin whispered. Just tell me what." Cassius looked around the small forge. 4 men, 1 pregnant woman, years of silence and humiliation packed into a single room, thick as smoke. Something clicked into place inside him, a realization that felt like metal cooling into its final shape. "We leave tonight," Cassius said, "but we ain't sneaking out like rats. We ain't running scared." He pointed toward the plantation house where candles still flickered in the upper windows. "Beaumont likes his games, likes his shows. Well, we go and give him a show he never forgets." Benjamin swallowed. "What you mean?" Cassius walked to the hidden pit he'd dug beneath the floorboards. He pulled the wooden plank aside, revealing the glinting shapes of weapons illuminated by ember light. Daggers, metal stakes, improvised hooks, rough, brutal tools forged in secret. Sarah gasped softly. Marcus bowed his head in understanding. Fletcher's breath caught. Benjamin's eyes widened with fierce hope. Cassius lifted one of the iron stakes, its weight familiar, comforting. "Tomorrow night is the governor's return reception," he said. "Room full of men who never lifted nothing heavier than a glass. Pritchard gon' be drunk, Beaumont gon' be proud, doors gon' be unlocked. Our brothers gon' be lined up in dresses again." He looked at them all, meeting each pair of eyes steadily. "We walk into that room as their entertainment." He closed his hand around the stake. "Then we stop the music." A heavy silence settled. Then Marcus exhaled slowly, a smile breaking through the tension. "Well then," he murmured, "sounds like we finally forging something worth keeping." Sarah's voice trembled, but it was steady with resolve. "You come back to us, Cass. You come back to your children." Cassius kissed her forehead. "I will," he promised. "Because after tomorrow, ain't nobody ever taken anything from us again." Outside, the wind shifted. The trees whispered warning. The dogs barked restlessly in their kennels. The night was changing, and so were they. The night of the governor's return reception arrived wrapped in a humid Mississippi darkness, thick enough to taste. Lanterns hung from the great oaks lining the Beaumont estate, their flames twitching in the wet air. The mansion glowed like a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers blazing, violins tuning, laughter spilling from open windows. Inside the quarters, Cassius felt the weight of the corset crushing against his ribs again, the smell of powder heavy in his throat, the wig scratchy on his scalp. But something was different tonight. Beneath the silk, beneath the humiliation, the weapons he had forged lay strapped tight against his thighs, hidden under layers of petticoats. Every movement reminded him they were there, steel, waiting. Across from him, Fletcher tightened his own corset, eyes full of fury barely contained. Marcus adjusted his wig, his hands steady despite the stakes. Benjamin's breath shook, but his grip on the concealed iron stake never faltered. "You remember the signals?" Cassius whispered. 4 nods. Sarah appeared at the doorway, eyes red but determined. She cupped Cassius's face with trembling hands. "You come back to me," she said. "Whatever happens in there, you walk out alive." Cassius leaned his forehead against hers. "I swear." Then the horn sounded from the mansion. It was time. The 6 men walked toward the great house in a straight line, tall, silent, statuesque in their dresses. From a distance, one might call them elegant. Up close, their eyes told a different story. Not fear, not shame. Purpose. They entered through the side door, as always. The music swelled. Guests milled about holding goblets of brandy, silk dresses swishing across polished floors. The governor himself, Albert Whitfield, stood near the dais with a cigar between his fingers, laughing thunderously with the county judge. "Ah, the dancers!" Beaumont trilled from across the room. He clapped his hands, his rings catching the chandelier's light. "Marvelous. Ladies and gentlemen, our evening's entertainment." Heads turned. Eyes gleamed with cruel anticipation. Cassius stepped into the center of the ballroom. His corseted chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths. Malcolm Pritchard had stationed himself by the main door, drunk already but alert enough. 2 guards lingered by the window. Davis, the young guard who had been overpowered days earlier, stood stiffly in the corner, hand near his holster, jaw clenched with resentment. Cassius scanned the room. The piano, the doors, the guests, the exits, the distance between him and Beaumont. Everything had to align with precision. Beaumont clapped again. Music. A waltz rose, soft and sweeping. Cassius stepped forward. 1, 2, 3, turn. 1, 2, 3. Curtsy. The room murmured its approval. Guests leaned forward, smirking. They expected ridicule. They expected submission. Instead, they were watching the quiet formation of a storm. Behind him, Marcus moved toward the bandstand. Benjamin drifted near the window guards. Fletcher eased closer to Pritchard. The other 2 men created a gentle circular pattern, drifting toward the room's center, setting the stage. Cassius lifted his arms, feigning grace. His sleeves fell back, revealing the faint glint of metal hidden beneath lace. The governor's wife gasped. "Henri, did you see that?" Beaumont waved a dismissive hand. "Props, my dear. Theatrics." Cassius's gaze found Thomas, the server, across the room. Thomas gave a barely perceptible nod. The clock chimed. 11. Everything slowed. Cassius inhaled. "Now," he said. The music stopped. Not gradually. Violently. Marcus slammed the piano lid shut with a thunderous crack that echoed across the ballroom. Guests jolted upright. Conversations choked into silence. "What is the meaning of—" Beaumont's protest froze as Cassius lifted his skirt and drew the iron stake. Gasps erupted. The governor's cigar dropped from his fingers. Pritchard fumbled for his gun, but Fletcher was already on him. The big man swung once, an arc of steel masked by silk, and Pritchard crashed into the doorframe unconscious, blood trailing down his temple. "Get the women out!" Judge Carlyle shrieked. "Oh!" Benjamin kicked the window guard in the knee and sent him crashing down. Marcus grabbed a wine bottle and smashed it against the second guard's head before he could draw. Panic ignited like wildfire. Guests scrambled, overturning tables, spilling wine across polished floors. Candles toppled. Screams rose in frantic waves. But through the chaos, Cassius walked with the calm of a man reclaiming his name. He strode toward Beaumont. The Count stumbled backward, tripping over his gilded chair. His powdered wig slid askew. "Guards! Somebody arrest them!" Beaumont shrieked, voice cracking with terror. "There ain't nobody left to arrest us," Cassius said. He stepped closer, each footfall steady. "You spent all your years breaking men, dressing us up, laughing at our pain, thinking silk could make us forget who we are." He raised the iron stake. "Tonight, you remember." Beaumont flailed like a cornered rat. "You cannot do this! Governor! Stop him!" But Whitfield had stumbled backward into a table, his face pale, staring in disbelief at the uprising playing out before him. "No man should be humiliated like this," Cassius said. "Not even by the law you wrote." He grabbed Beaumont by the collar, yanking him to his feet. "You wanted a show," Cassius whispered. "Now watch." He didn't strike him. Not yet. Instead, Cassius turned and hurled the iron stake into the chandelier's chain. Sparks rained down as crystal rained onto the ballroom floor. The chandelier crashed, exploding into shards. Flames from toppled candles licked across the spilled brandy. Fire crawled like a hungry animal toward velvet curtains. Benjamin shouted, "Cassius, the blazes spread in!" Good. Chaos was the distraction they needed. Fire would erase the evidence. Panic would split their pursuers. Cassius shoved Beaumont aside, sending him sprawling into a cluster of shrieking guests. "Run!" Cassius roared. "Get every enslaved soul out the back!" The message spread like lightning. Thomas flung open the servants' corridor. Sarah appeared, leading women and children. Fletcher lifted Ruth into his arms. Marcus ushered elders toward the rear courtyard. Pritchard began to stir. Cassius knelt and pressed the heel of his boot on the man's wrist, pinning him. "Lay still, or it'll be the last thing you do." Pritchard whimpered. Smoke thickened. Men coughed, clawing at their throats. The governor staggered blindly, pushing past Cassius toward the exit. "This is treason," he choked out. Cassius ignored him. His eyes were fixed on one man, Beaumont, crawling across the floor, coughing violently as the fire spread up the curtains like a blazing ladder. Cassius walked to him. Beaumont collapsed onto his back, eyes wild. "Please," he rasped, "I'll give you whatever you want." Cassius crouched. "You think I want your money?" He leaned close, his voice a low growl. "I want my name back." Then Cassius did something that would haunt Beaumont longer than any wound. He stood up, turned away, and left him there, stripped of dignity, stripped of control, stripped of the power he had wielded like a whip. "You ain't worth killing," Cassius said. He ran, through corridors thick with smoke, down the servants' stairs, out into the night, where dozens of enslaved men, women, and children fled toward the tree line illuminated by firelight. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Cassius, hurry!" He pulled her close, kissing her forehead, then lifted Ruth from Fletcher's arms. Together they ran across the field, toward the woods, toward the bridge where their freedom waited. Behind them, flames roared higher. The Beaumont plantation burned like a final sunset, loud, furious, and irreversible. Dogs barked in the distance. Gunshots cracked. Pritchard had revived enough to give chase. "Keep going," Cassius shouted. They ran through brush thick enough to tear skin, their breaths harsh, their legs burning. The wind carried smoke and the frantic howls of men losing both their property and their pride. Then, up ahead, a lantern swung gently. A wagon emerged from the shadows. A Quaker driver raised a hand. "Get in, quickly," he whispered. "You're safe now." One by one they climbed aboard, hearts pounding. Cassius was the last. He turned back. The plantation was ablaze, an inferno swallowing the house where his dignity had been mocked for years. Let it burn, he thought. Let the world see. Sarah's hand touched his. "We're free," she whispered. "Not yet," Cassius said. "But tonight, we started something that can't ever be undone." The wagon rolled into darkness. The fire behind them burned long into the night. The wagon rolled north beneath a sky stripped clean by firelight. The stars above Mississippi shimmered through a smoke-hazed veil, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness to the end of Beaumont's dominion. Cassius held Ruth close, her tiny fingers clutching his collar as she slept, exhausted from the night's terror. Sarah leaned against him, her breaths shallow but steady. Around them, the others huddled together beneath rough blankets, whispering prayers into the wind. No one slept. The road was rough, and every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in their ears. They knew that Mississippi's slave hunters were relentless. They knew the law would organize a pursuit by dawn. They knew dogs would be loosed. Cassius kept one hand on the small iron knife strapped inside his jacket, the blade he had forged with his own hands. Steel had been his life, his labor, his chains. Tonight, steel was his claim to freedom. The Quaker driver, a thin man named Elias, guided the wagon through a dense grove of pines and spoke without looking back. "You made quite a storm down there," he murmured. "Fire seen for miles." Cassius tightened his hold on Ruth. "You heard?" "Folks along the river are talking already," Elias said. "Say the Beaumont estate has fallen into the ground like the walls of Jericho." A murmur swept through the wagon. Some slaves gasped, others crossed themselves. Cassius didn't speak. He wasn't proud. He wasn't triumphant. He felt only a deep, solemn ache, like the quiet after a forge goes cold. The fire had taken what remained of Beaumont's power, But fire also took memories. Rooms where slaves had prayed, barns where children had played, soil soaked with suffering. Freedom always demanded a price, and Mississippi had paid it in flames. The group traveled through the night until the horizon paled with the first flicker of dawn. Elias steered them toward an old tobacco barn hidden in a thicket. "You'll rest here," Elias said, helping Sarah climb down. "Slave catchers don't search abandoned barns during early light. Too many snakes." Benjamin shuddered. Snakes better than dogs. Inside, the barn smelled of dust and rotted leaves. Cassius set Ruth down on a pile of burlap sacks. Sarah sat beside their daughter and kissed her forehead. Cassius watched them for a long moment, letting his gaze linger on the curve of Sarah's cheek, the way her eyelids fluttered with exhaustion. He almost lost them. This thought came like a blow. He stepped outside and leaned against the barn wall, breathing deeply until the morning air stopped spinning around him. Marcus joined him a moment later. "You did good, son." Cassius shook his head. "That fire'll bring hell down on the people who stayed behind." Marcus laid a hand on his shoulder. "Those who stayed behind got no choice. Those who ran got no choice neither." "What happened tonight?" He paused, his voice steady. "It wasn't revenge. It was truth finally coming due." Cassius closed his eyes. The truth had a weight to it, heavy as iron. He carried it the way he carried a hammer, knowing it could destroy or create. He prayed he had chosen creation. By midday, Elias returned with word from the Underground Railroad. A station awaited them 2 miles north, at the home of a widow named Abigail Harper. They moved quietly, avoiding roads, ducking beneath magnolia branches, heavy with white blossoms. When they arrived, Abigail, gray-haired, gentle-eyed, ushered them into her cellar with a kindness Cassius had forgotten could exist in the world. She fed the children cornmeal mush sweetened with a little molasses. She wrapped Sarah's blistered feet. She pressed a cool cloth to Cassius's swollen face. "You rest tonight," she said. "Tomorrow you'll cross the river." The river. The Ohio. The name alone brought a tremor to Cassius's heart. On one side lay bondage. On the other, possibility. He knew that possibility wasn't guaranteed happiness, but it was more than they had ever been offered. That night, Cassius could not sleep. Abigail's cellar was safe, but his mind was a whirlwind. He remembered the wig falling from his head, the chandeliers crashing. Beaumont's face twisted in dread. The moment he chose not to kill, he wondered if God would judge him for not striking down his tormentor. He wondered if mercy was strength or cowardice. Near midnight, Sarah found him sitting on the steps leading out of the cellar. She wrapped a shawl around his shoulders and sat beside him. "You're thinking too loud," she whispered. Cassius exhaled a shaky breath. "I should have ended him, Sarah." "No," she said gently. "You ended what he was." Cassius looked at her. "What if that ain't enough?" Sarah rested her head on his shoulder. "You gave him something he could never give you, dignity, and that's gonna haunt him longer than death." Her hand slipped into his. Cassius didn't respond, but he leaned into her warmth, letting her calm seep into his bones. The next morning, before dawn fully broke, the group set out on foot. Abigail led them westward to a marshy inlet, where a fisherman named Lowell waited with 2 skiffs hidden among cattails. Lowell was a large man with weathered skin and careful eyes. "2 at a time," he said. "River's calm, but the fog is dense. Stay low." Cassius lifted Ruth, now awake and quiet, into his arms. Sarah climbed into the skiff behind him. Marcus stepped into the second boat. Benjamin followed. The oars dipped quietly. Water parted like silk beneath them. Halfway across, Cassius turned to look back. Mississippi's shore was mostly dark, but a faint glow still smeared the sky where the Beaumont estate had stood. Smoke curled into the clouds like ghosts refusing to leave. Cassius whispered a prayer, for those who survived, for those who didn't, for those still chained. When the skiff touched the northern bank, Sarah grasped Cassius's arm. "Is this it?" she asked. Cassius nodded. "This is free soil." Sarah covered her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. She pressed her face into Ruth's hair, holding her daughter with a desperate, joyful fierceness. Benjamin fell to his knees, sobbing openly. Marcus placed a hand on the young man's back and whispered a hymn. Cassius stood in silence. He felt the wind shift, brushing his cheek like a blessing. It carried no commands, no lashes, no threats, only possibility. They traveled through Ohio, then north through Indiana, and finally across into Ontario. Months passed. Winters arrived with bitter snow. Summers warmed their new homes. Children grew taller, new babies were born, and Cassius built a forge. It wasn't large, just a wooden shed with a stone hearth and anvil. But it was his. Every nail hammered, every plank fitted, every horseshoe forged belonged to his hands. People came from miles around to buy tools from the tall blacksmith with the grave eyes and the gentle voice. They never knew his past. They never knew the weight behind his silence. They only knew he worked with a devotion that made metal sing. One corner of the forge held an unusual display, a tattered strip of burgundy silk framed behind glass. When someone asked about it, Cassius would pause, set down his hammer, and run a thumb along the wooden frame. "That," he would say quietly, "is a piece of the night I stopped being owned." Sarah would watch him from the doorway, Ruth at her side, and smile with a pride that softened every scar. Cassius never returned to Mississippi. He never heard Beaumont's name again. But whispers drifted north over the years, that the Count had lost everything, his fortune seized, his reputation destroyed, his final days spent alone in a crumbling estate somewhere near Marseille. Cassius never celebrated that news. He didn't need to. His revenge was written in the life he built, in his daughter's laughter, in the songs the freedmen sang on Sunday mornings, in every swing of his hammer that shaped a world he finally belonged to. Some nights, sitting by the forge with the fire glowing low, Cassius would hear the faint echo of violins, the ghost of silk rustling, the tremor of humiliation. But then he would hear Sarah humming in the kitchen. He would smell the bread she baked. He would feel Ruth lean against him, warm and safe. And the echoes faded. Cassius Washington lived to be 68 years old. When he died, his children placed that strip of burgundy silk inside his coffin, resting over his heart, because it wasn't a symbol of shame. It was triumph, a reminder of the night he forged freedom in the fire of humiliation, a reminder that no costume, no mask, can hide the truth of a man. And long after he was gone, older townsfolk would tell newcomers, "If you pass by the old forge at dusk, sometimes you'll hear a hammer ringing. Soft, steady, like a man still at work." They never knew how right they were. Do you believe stories like this should be told? Comment yes below.